The war tactics that made America hard to defeat. This is American Global Force. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from, your city and your country. And please subscribe, like, and share this story so we can reach more people and begin to question the history we were told. Because what you are about to hear is not just history. It is a quiet war inside a louder war. A story that begins in the shadows of the American Revolutionary War, where nothing was ever as clear as it seemed. And far from the grand speeches and proud flags there moved men who did not fight for glory but for survival. Men like Kunta and Adam, whose footsteps were softer than the wind and whose eyes had learned to read danger long before the first shot was fired. And in those early days, the British Army stood like a giant, disciplined, confident, marching in straight lines with shining uniforms that reflected power. But what they did not understand was that the land itself had already chosen a different kind of war, one that could not be measured by numbers or tradition. And it was in this uncertainty that George Washington began to see a truth that many around him feared, that to face such a force head-on would mean destruction. And so a different path was taken. Not one of pride, but of patience. Not one of noise, but of silence. And in forests where the air felt heavy and every branch seemed to watch, small groups moved like shadows, choosing when to strike and when to vanish, turning every tree into cover and every path into a trap. And the British soldiers, trained for open battle, found themselves lost in a world that refused to follow their rules, where the enemy did not stand still, where every victory felt empty because the fight never truly ended. And there was a night, cold and unforgiving, when the river near Trenton seemed to whisper danger, and yet the decision was made to cross, not because it was easy, but because it was unexpected. And as the ice cracked underfoot and the silence pressed down on every man, there was a tension that could not be spoken, a fear that if this moment failed, everything would be lost. And yet when the attack came, it was swift, precise, and shocking, a reminder that surprise could be more powerful than strength. And far away in smaller camps, men like Kwame and Yaw spoke in low voices about this new way of war, where patience became a weapon, and time itself was turned against the enemy. And this was the beginning of what would later be understood as the Fabian strategy, a method that demanded restraint, that required leaders to accept smaller victories instead of risking everything in one battle. And it was not easy because many wanted glory, many wanted a decisive end. But Washington held firm, understanding that the British were far from home, that every day stretched their supply lines, that every mile increased their burden, and so instead of seeking to destroy the enemy in one moment, the goal became to outlast them, to make the war so long and so difficult that victory itself would lose its meaning for those who came across the ocean to fight it. And in this slow, burning conflict, the real battles were often unseen, fought in the minds of soldiers who began to question their purpose, who felt the weight of distance and the strain of endless uncertainty. And for men like Kunta and Adam, the war became something deeper, a test of endurance where every step forward carried risk, where every sound in the forest could mean danger. And yet there was also a strange confidence growing, because they understood something their enemy did not, that war was not always about facing the storm, but about becoming part of it, blending into it, until it could no longer distinguish friend from foe. And there were moments when the British would march through a quiet area only to be struck from all sides, quick shots followed by silence, confusion spreading faster than fear, and by the time they tried to respond, there was nothing left to fight, only echoes and uncertainty. And this constant pressure began to wear them down, not in dramatic defeats, but in small, relentless losses that chipped away at their strength. And as weeks turned into months and months into years, the idea of a quick victory faded, replaced by a growing realization that this war could not be won in the way they had expected. And still the tension remained, because for every success, there was the risk of failure. For every victory, the possibility of defeat. And Washington knew that one wrong move could destroy everything. And so he continued to avoid large-scale battles unless absolutely necessary, choosing instead to maneuver, to reposition, to keep the army alive rather than risking it for uncertain gain. And this approach required discipline not just from leaders, but from every soldier, because it meant accepting uncertainty. It meant trusting a strategy that did not always bring immediate results. And yet over time, the effects became clear as the British grew tired, as their resources stretched thin, as their confidence began to falter. And in the quiet moments between battles, there was a sense that something was changing, that the balance of power was shifting not through force but through persistence. And it was in these moments that men like Kwame would look at the horizon and understand that this war was not just about independence. It was about redefining how wars could be fought, about proving that a smaller force could challenge a greater one, not by matching its strength, but by exploiting its weaknesses. And this realization carried a weight that went beyond the battlefield, because it suggested a future where power was not absolute, where strategy could overcome size, where patience could defeat aggression. And as the story of this war continued to unfold, it became clear that the tactics being used were not temporary solutions, but foundational ideas that would influence conflicts for generations to come, shaping not just victories, but the very nature of warfare itself. And in the end, the greatest lesson was not found in any single battle, but in the understanding that adaptability, resilience, and the ability to think differently were the true weapons that made survival possible. And as the fires of the revolution burned on, these lessons settled into the minds of those who fought, preparing them for a future that would demand even greater challenges, even greater innovation, and even greater resolve. Because the story of war was far from over, and what began in the shadows of forests would one day echo across the world in ways no one could yet imagine. The years moved forward like a slow turning wheel, and the echoes of the American Revolutionary War did not fade. They changed shape. And what began in forests and shadows would soon face a new test in a divided land during the American Civil War, where the scale of war expanded beyond anything the earlier fighters had imagined. And men like Kwabena and Adiza stood in camps where the air smelled of iron and smoke instead of trees and rain. And this time, the enemy was not across an ocean, but across a line drawn through the same soil, and yet the lessons of patience and strategy still whispered beneath the noise, because once again, the question was not only how to fight, but how to endure. And it quickly became clear that this war would not be decided by one great battle. It would and it quickly became clear that this war would not be decided by one great battle. It would be shaped by something deeper, something heavier, the power to continue when others could not. And it was here that industrial strength revealed itself as a silent weapon. Factories producing weapons faster than they could be destroyed, railroads carrying men and supplies across vast distances, creating a system that turned movement into power. And leaders like Ulysses S. Grant began to understand that victory would come not from a single moment of brilliance, but from sustained pressure, a constant push that would slowly break the enemy's ability to resist. And this idea of total war began to take shape, not just fighting armies, but targeting the systems that supported them, cutting off supplies, destroying infrastructure, forcing the opponent into a position where even survival became difficult. And in this environment, soldiers like Mensa and Quadwo learned that war was no longer just about courage on the battlefield. It was about endurance across time, about surviving long enough to see the enemy weaken, and battles came and went, some fierce and unforgettable, others quiet but significant. And each one added weight to the growing realization that the side with greater resources, better organization, and stronger logistics held an advantage that could not be ignored. And as the conflict stretched on, the strain became visible, not just in the losses, but in the exhaustion, the slow wearing down of spirit. And yet this was only the beginning of a larger transformation, because the lessons learned here would carry forward into an even greater conflict, one that would span continents and oceans during World War II, where the scale of war reached a level that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. And this time the challenge was not just to fight, but to coordinate across vast distances, to bring together land, sea, and air into a single force that could strike with precision and power. And men like Kojoa and Yaw found themselves part of a system that moved like a living machine, where every piece had a role, every action connected to another. And it was in operations like the landings in Normandy that the true strength of this approach became clear. The ability to plan, to prepare, to deliver overwhelming force at the right moment and place, and yet even here the influence of earlier tactics could be seen, because flexibility remained essential. The ability to adapt when plans met reality, when unexpected challenges emerged. And this was where specialized infantry tactics began to evolve further, moving away from rigid formations toward smaller, more adaptable units that could respond quickly, that could think independently while still working as part of a larger strategy. And soldiers learned to read the battlefield in new ways, to identify weak points, to exploit opportunities, to turn confusion into advantage. And this shift was not just practical. It was necessary because the complexity of modern warfare demanded it. And technology also began to play a greater role, not just in weapons, but in communication, in intelligence, in the ability to gather information and act on it faster than ever before. And as planes flew overhead and radios connected units across distances, the battlefield became more than a physical space. It became a network of information and action. And this combination of industrial power, logistical strength, and tactical flexibility created a force that was difficult to match because it was not limited to one approach. It could shift, it could adapt, it could sustain itself in ways that others could not, and yet beneath all of this there remained a constant tension. Because every advantage brought new challenges, every innovation created new uncertainties, and for men like Kwabena and Adisa, the war was not just about survival, but about understanding a world that was changing faster than they could have imagined. And as the conflict moved toward its end, there was a sense that something fundamental had shifted, that war itself had been transformed, that the lessons of the past had been combined with the realities of the present to create something new, something more complex. And as the guns fell silent and the world began to rebuild, the impact of these changes did not disappear. They settled into the foundation of future strategies, shaping how conflicts would be approached, how victories would be pursued, and how power would be understood. And in the quiet, after the storm, there was a realization that the true strength of this evolving approach was not just in its ability to win wars, but in its capacity to learn from them, to carry forward the lessons of each conflict into the next, creating a cycle of adaptation that would continue to define its character. And as the years moved on and new challenges emerged, these lessons would be tested again and again in different lands, under different conditions, proving that the story of these tactics was far from complete, that it was still unfolding, still evolving, still shaping the future in ways that could not yet be fully seen. And for those who had lived through it, who had seen the transformation with their own eyes, there was an understanding that war was no longer a simple contest of strength. It was a complex interplay of resources, strategy, and human will, and that understanding would guide the path forward into the uncertainties that lay ahead. The silence after great wars never lasts. It only hides the next storm, and as the world shifted into a new era, the battlefield changed once again, moving far from open fields and massive armies into dense forests and unfamiliar lands during the Vietnam War, where nothing followed the expected rules, and men like Quadwo and Eco arrived believing in the strength of the systems built during earlier conflicts, the power of industry, the precision of planning, the confidence that overwhelming force could shape any outcome. But the jungle did not care for such confidence. It swallowed sound, it bent light, it turned certainty into doubt, and here the enemy did not stand in formation. They did not wait to be seen. They moved quietly, blending into villages, disappearing into tunnels, striking quickly, and vanishing before any response could take form. And this was a different kind of war, one that echoed the early struggles of the American Revolutionary War, but with a reversal of roles that unsettled even the most experienced commanders. Because now the challenge was not how to resist a stronger force, but how to confront an enemy that refused to be defined. And as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the tension grew. Every step through the jungle carried uncertainty. Every shadow felt alive. And soldiers like Nana and Adisa learned quickly that survival depended not just on strength, but on awareness, on the ability to read signs that were almost invisible. A broken branch, a disturbed patch of earth, a silence that felt too complete. And yet even with this awareness, the danger remained constant, because the enemy understood the land in a way that outsiders couldn't, using it as both shield and weapon. And this forced a shift in thinking, a move towards smaller, more flexible units that could operate independently, that could respond quickly, that could adapt to changing conditions without waiting for distant orders. And this evolution of infantry tactics became essential, because rigid formations and predictable movements only made them vulnerable. And so soldiers learned to think differently, to move differently, to fight differently, becoming part of the environment rather than standing against it. And alongside this shift came the growing reliance on advanced technology and surveillance, tools that promised to reveal what could not be seen, aircraft flying overhead with sensors that could detect movement beneath the trees, listening devices placed in the ground to capture the faintest vibrations, communication systems that connected units across distances that once would have felt impossible. And for a moment, it seemed as though technology might solve the problem, that it could bring clarity to the chaos. But the reality proved more complex because information alone was not enough. Understanding was required, and the enemy adapted as well, changing patterns, avoiding detection, turning every new advantage into a temporary one. And this constant cycle of adaptation created a tension that never truly eased, a sense that the war was always shifting just beyond reach. And in the midst of this uncertainty, the importance of rapid mobilization and logistics remained clear. The ability to move resources quickly, to support operations even in difficult terrain, to maintain pressure despite the challenges. And yet even this strength had its limits, because the nature of the conflict did not always allow for traditional measures of success. There were no clear lines, no definitive victories, only moments of progress followed by renewed uncertainty. And for men like Quadwo and Ekau, this created a deeper struggle, one that went beyond the physical demands of war, a mental battle against doubt, against the feeling that the rules had changed in ways that were not fully understood. And it was in this environment that the lessons of the past began to reemerge in unexpected ways, the importance of patience, of choosing when to engage and when to withdraw, of recognizing that not every fight needed to be fought. And these ideas, once used by a weaker force to resist a stronger one, now became tools for navigating a conflict where strength alone could not guarantee success. And as the years passed and the war continued, the need for adaptation became undeniable, shaping not only tactics but also the broader approach to warfare, influencing how future conflicts would be planned and executed. And when the focus shifted to more recent years, into the last 20 years where new challenges emerged in places far from traditional battlefields, the influence of these experiences became even more apparent because modern warfare had become a blend of everything that came before, combining advanced technology with the need for human judgment, precision with flexibility, speed with caution. And soldiers like Kobena and Mensa found themselves operating in environments where the line between combat and everyday life was often blurred, where decisions carried consequences that extended beyond the immediate moment, and where the ability to gather and interpret information quickly became as important as the ability to act on it. And in this new landscape, drones moved silently through the sky, providing real-time intelligence, guiding operations with a level of accuracy that once would have seemed impossible, while communication systems allowed units to coordinate in ways that reduced confusion and increased effectiveness. And yet the core challenges remained: the need to understand the environment, to anticipate the actions of an adaptable enemy, to balance strength with strategy. And as these tactics continued to evolve, it became clear that the true power of this approach was not in any single element, but in the combination of all of them, the ability to draw on lessons from the past while embracing the possibilities of the present, creating a force that could respond to a wide range of challenges, that could shift between different forms of warfare as needed, and that could continue to learn and adapt over time. And this ongoing evolution ensured that even in the face of uncertainty, even in conflicts that did not follow traditional patterns, there remained a capacity to adjust, to innovate, to find new ways to operate effectively. And for those who experienced it, who lived through the constant change and the relentless pressure, there was an understanding that war had become something far more complex than it had once been, a dynamic and unpredictable environment where success depended not just on power but on the ability to think, to adapt, and to endure. And as the story moved forward into an uncertain future, these lessons would remain, shaping the path ahead and influencing the decisions of those who would face the next challenges, because in the end, the nature of warfare is not fixed. It is always changing, always evolving, and those who can adapt to that change are the ones who stand the greatest chance of enduring it. The story was never meant to end neatly because war itself does not follow clean lines or simple conclusions, and as the years continued to unfold, the patterns that had been built over centuries began to reveal something deeper, something more unsettling, that the true strength of a nation at war was not just in its weapons or its numbers, but in its ability to change faster than its enemies could understand. And men like Kwame and Adisa found themselves in a world where yesterday's victories meant very little if tomorrow demanded something entirely different. And this was the hidden layer of warfare that few ever spoke about. The silent race of adaptation, where every tactic that worked would eventually be studied, copied, and countered, forcing a constant evolution that never truly stopped. And it was in this endless cycle that the real challenge emerged, not how to win a single conflict, but how to remain effective across many, across different terrains, different enemies, different expectations. And this required a mindset that went beyond traditional thinking, a willingness to question even the most successful strategies, to accept that what worked before might fail without warning. And as Kwame walked through a base filled with screens showing real-time data from distant regions, he realized that war had become something almost unrecognizable compared to the past. And yet, at its core, it was still driven by the same principles: control, timing, deception, endurance, and the ability to exploit weakness. And what had changed was the speed, the scale, and the complexity, because now decisions made in seconds could shape outcomes across entire regions, and information had become as valuable as firepower, sometimes even more so. And this created a new kind of battlefield, one that extended beyond physical space into networks, into communication systems, into the very flow of knowledge itself. And for soldiers like Adisa, this meant learning to fight on multiple levels at once, to understand not just the terrain beneath their feet, but the invisible systems that surrounded them. And this added a layer of tension that was always present, a sense that the fight was never limited to what could be seen. And yet even in this advanced environment, the lessons of the past continued to guide decisions, the importance of patience, the value of choosing the right moment, the need to remain unpredictable. And there were times when the most effective action was not to strike, but to wait, to observe, to gather information until the opportunity became clear. And this patience often made the difference between success and failure, because in a world where everything moved quickly, the ability to slow down, to think, to plan became a powerful advantage. And as operations unfolded in different parts of the world, often in regions where the lines between ally and enemy were not always clear, the need for understanding became even more critical, because without it, even the most advanced tactics could lead to unintended consequences. And this brought a new kind of responsibility, one that extended beyond the immediate goal of defeating an opponent into the broader impact of each action. And for Kwame, this was one of the most difficult parts of modern warfare, the realization that every decision carried weight not just in the present, but in the future, shaping how conflicts would evolve, how relationships would change, and how stability could either be strengthened or weakened. And this complexity made it clear that there were no easy answers, no perfect strategies, only choices that had to be made with incomplete information, under pressure, with the understanding that outcomes could never be fully controlled. And yet, despite this uncertainty, the system continued to function, continued to adapt, because it was built on the idea of learning, of taking each experience and using it to refine the next approach. And this process of continuous improvement became one of its greatest strengths, allowing it to respond to challenges in ways that were not always predictable, but often effective. And as Kwame looked back on the long history that had led to this moment, from the forests of early Sungers to the industrial battles of the past, to the complex operations of the present, he saw a pattern that connected them all, a constant movement toward greater flexibility, greater awareness, greater integration of different elements into a unified whole. And this integration was perhaps the most important development of all because it allowed different tactics to be used together to support each other, to create a system that was more than the sum of its parts. And this made it difficult for opponents to find a single point of weakness, because the strength did not come from one area but from the interaction of many. And yet this did not make it invincible. Far from it, because every system has limits, every strategy has vulnerabilities, and in asymmetric conflicts where opponents refused to engage on conventional terms, these limits became more visible, forcing further adaptation, further innovation, and this ongoing process ensured that the story would continue. The new chapters would be written, shaped by new challenges and new responses, and as the sun set over the base and the screens dimmed into a quiet glow, Kwame understood that the real battle was not just against external enemies, but against complacency, against the temptation to rely too heavily on past successes, because in a world that was constantly changing, the greatest risk was standing still, and this understanding became a guiding principle, a reminder that survival in such an environment required constant vigilance, constant learning, constant readiness to change direction when necessary. And as he prepared for the next mission, whatever form it might take, he carried with him not just the tools of modern warfare, but the lessons of history, the knowledge that every tactic had a purpose, every strategy had a place, and that the true power lay in knowing how and when to use them. And in that knowledge there was both strength and uncertainty, because while it provided the means to face challenges, it also revealed how complex those challenges could be. And perhaps that is what makes this story so compelling, not the idea of being unbeatable, but the reality of constantly striving to adapt, to improve, to navigate a world where nothing remains the same for long. And as the night settled in and the quiet returned, there was a sense that the next chapter was already beginning, waiting to be written by those who would face the unknown with the same determination, the same creativity, and the same willingness to learn that had defined every chapter before it, ensuring that the legacy of these tactics would continue to evolve, to influence, and to shape the future in ways that could only be understood as time moved forward. The story does not end with victory or defeat. It continues in the quiet decisions that shape what comes next. And as the world moved deeper into the modern age, the tactics that once began in forests and open fields transformed into something far more complex, something that blended past and present into a force that could not be easily predicted. And men like Kwesi and found themselves standing at the edge of a new kind of battlefield, where information moved faster than bullets and decisions carried weight across continents. And it was here that the full combination of strategy began to reveal itself, the merging of asymmetric thinking, attrition, industrial strength, adaptability, and technology into one evolving system. And while many believed that the age of traditional warfare had ended, the truth was far more unsettling, because every lesson, from the American Revolutionary War to the Vietnam War, still lived beneath the surface, shaping every move, every plan, every response, and in command rooms filled with quiet tension, leaders studied not just maps, but patterns, not just enemy positions, but intentions, and the influence of commanders like George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, and Dwight D. Eisenhower could still be felt, not as distant history, but as living principles, guiding decisions in ways that were not always visible, because each of them had understood something essential, that war is not static. It changes with time, with technology, with the will of those who fight it. And this understanding became the foundation for how tactics evolved over the last 20 years, where speed became critical, where the ability to respond in moments rather than days could determine success or failure. And rapid mobilization reached a level that once would have seemed impossible, with forces able to move across oceans and arrive prepared, supported by systems that ensured they could sustain operations in almost any environment. And yet even with this capability, there remained an awareness that power alone was not enough, that the nature of modern conflict often required precision rather than overwhelming force. And this is where advanced technology and surveillance became central, not just as tools, but as extensions of strategy, allowing commanders to see beyond immediate surroundings, to gather intelligence in real time, to anticipate threats before they fully emerged, and drones moved through the sky like silent watchers, satellites observed from above, communication networks connected units in ways that reduced uncertainty and increased coordination. And for soldiers like Kofi and Mensa, this created a battlefield that was both clearer and more complex at the same time, because while information was more available than ever before, the challenge of interpreting it remained. The need to make decisions under pressure did not disappear. It intensified. And this is where the human element continued to play a critical role, because no matter how advanced the technology became, it could not replace the instinct, the judgment, the experience of those on the ground. And this balance between machine and mind became one of the defining features of modern tactics, creating a system that was both powerful and adaptable. And as conflicts unfolded in different parts of the world, often in environments that did not resemble traditional battlefields, the importance of flexibility became even more clear, because these were not wars with clear front lines or defined endings. They were complex, shifting situations where the enemy could appear and disappear, where alliances could change, where the line between combat and everyday life was often blurred, and in such conditions, the ability to adapt quickly, to shift strategies, to respond to new information became essential. And this is where the legacy of specialized infantry tactics reached its peak, with small units operating independently, making decisions in real time, using their training and experience to navigate uncertainty. And these units became the cutting edge of operations, capable of striking with precision, of gathering intelligence, of responding to threats in ways that larger formations could not. And yet, even as these tactics proved effective, they also revealed the limits of power, because in asymmetric conflicts where the enemy did not follow conventional rules, where they blended into populations and avoided direct confrontation, the challenges remained significant. And this brought the story back to one of its earliest lessons, that not every conflict can be won through force alone, that understanding the environment, the culture, the motivations of the enemy is just as important as any weapon or technology. And this realization has shaped how strategies continue to evolve, influencing training, planning, and execution in ways that reflect a deeper awareness of the complexities of modern warfare. And as the years continue to pass, the unpredictability remains, because each new conflict introduces variables that cannot be fully anticipated. And yet the foundation, built over centuries, provides a level of resilience, a capacity to adapt, that makes it difficult to defeat in conventional terms. And for men like Kwesi and Adam, the journey through these changing landscapes has been one of constant learning, of facing uncertainty and finding ways to navigate it, of understanding that strength is not just about power, but about the ability to evolve. And as they look toward the future, there is a sense that the story is far from over, that new challenges will emerge, new tactics will be developed, new lessons will be learned, and that the cycle of adaptation will continue, shaping the nature of conflict in ways that cannot yet be fully understood. And perhaps that is the most important truth of all, that there is no final form, no perfect strategy, only a continuous process of change, driven by the need to survive, to adapt, to overcome. And as this story comes to a close, it leaves behind not a simple conclusion, but a deeper question, one that lingers beyond the battlefield, about the nature of power, about the balance between strength and understanding, about the choices that define not just how wars are fought, but how they are remembered. And in that question lies the true legacy of the tactics that have made this force so difficult to defeat, not because they guarantee victory, but because they ensure the ability to endure, to adapt, and to face whatever comes next with a readiness shaped by the lessons of the past and the uncertainties of the future. Welcome to American Global Force, where we uncover the deeper truths behind history and power. Tell me where you are watching from, your city and your country. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so now. Like this video and share it, so more people can discover stories like this and understand the forces that shape our world.